Welcome back to the fourth installation of us breaking down various ambiguous backfields, looking at trends and seeing what we can conclude from said trends. If you want to see any more backfields covered in this series, just let me know in the comments section. I've added a couple based on what subscribers have suggested. We start off with the Pittsburgh Steelers, and this week, Cordarrelle Patterson took a big step up in Jaylen Warren's absence. He was by far the most efficient back. His 6 carries for 43 yards was 7.2 a carry with a long of 12, so that means he was consistently getting chunk gains. Najee Harris had more than twice as many carries. He only had 19 yards. That's 1.5 per carry and a long of 5. And so Cordarrelle Patterson was much more efficient with his carries. I'm not going to add in Aaron Shamklin because he's probably not going to get any work, and he only had 1 carry. I'm guessing Jaylen Warren's going to be back pretty soon, and then it'll go back to a 3-man rotation. When we look at the receiving work, Cordarrelle Patterson had 2 targets, 2 receptions, and 19 yards. That's 9.5 per catch. Najee Harris was much more involved in the passing game, finishing with 6 targets, 3 receptions, and 54 receiving yards, averaging 18 per catch, but with a long gain of 32. Now we look at the snap shares, rush shares, and target shares. What I've done in this video is averaged out weeks 1 through 3 together for each one of these backfields, and then put week 4 there so that we can compare week 4 to the previous 3 weeks' averages. It's a lot easier to read the numbers than if you're having to read an entire Excel sheet full of data here. And so when we look at Najee Harris, on average through the first 3 weeks, he's played 53% of the snaps. In Jaylen Warren's absence, that went all the way up to 69%. And so that bodes well for his total usage in the future should Jaylen Warren miss an extended period of time or even just 1 week. However, you would hope for a lot more efficiency, but still. When we look at his average rush share through the first 3 weeks, his 51.35% was a lot more than the 43.33% we saw in this game. Justin Fields had 10 carries, and Cordarrelle Patterson had 6, and so they combined for 16 to Najee Harris's 13, but he was still the leading rusher in terms of attempts. When we look at his target share, on average, he's had 12.08%. Well, that went up to 18.75%, and so that is encouraging that when Jaylen Warren misses time, it looks as though Najee Harris is taking his targets with him. Obviously, Jaylen Warren didn't play in week 4, so there's nothing to conclude there. When we look at Cordarrelle Patterson, in the absence of Jaylen Warren, he played 13% of the snaps. That is still less than the 18% on average, so that is a little bit interesting. It is interesting, but it's just 1 game, but that is something to note. When we look at his rush share, his 20% was much more than his 9.41% rush share on average, and his 6.25% target share was a little bit up from his 5.38 average. What can we conclude here? We can conclude that in the absence of Jaylen Warren, Najee Harris is taking up a lot more of the total backfield touches. However, in this specific game, he was really inefficient. In general, Jaylen Warren has been the most efficient back. He just hasn't gotten the volume. Najee Harris has gotten a lot more volume. He's been relatively efficient, but not in this past game. And Cordarrelle Patterson on limited touches has looked absolutely explosive. If you have really deep benches, I think Cordarrelle Patterson, or if you're in a large league, could be a good bench stash in the event that, hey, if Jaylen Warren and Harris are out, he could have a big game. Obviously, you're rostering Jaylen Warren and Najee Harris. Najee Harris is a regular RB2 for you. It's great if he's your flex. And with Jaylen Warren, he's kind of a desperation flex play. If he doesn't get a touchdown, you're probably going to be disappointed. And so we'll have to keep track of Jaylen Warren's health. But it looks as though, for the time being, this is clearly Najee Harris's backfield. Looking at the Minnesota Vikings backfield, Aaron Jones was in a revenge game against his former team, the Green Bay Packers. I was kind of disappointed for him that he didn't score a touchdown, but he still had a pretty good game. He led the backfield with 22 carries for 93 yards, averaging 4.2 per carry with a long of 17. The only other running back utilized in this game, as it has been the entire season, is Ty Chandler. He only finished with 3 carries for 5 yards, though, averaging 1.7 per carry with a long of 3. When we look at the receiving work, Ty Chandler finished with 1 target, 1 reception, and 8 yards. Aaron Jones, however, had 5 targets, 4 receptions, and 46 yards. So Aaron Jones had 11.5 per catch, pretty solid with a long of 14. And so that means he was just really consistent with his gains. Overall, a relatively efficient game for Aaron Jones and a pretty inefficient game on a limited basis for Ty Chandler. When we look at their splits, Through the first 3 weeks, Aaron Jones has averaged 59% of the snaps. Well, in this game, they definitely tried to feed him. He finished with 82% of the snaps. On average, he's had 53.07% of the rushes. In this game, he had 59.46, so a slight uptick there. And looking at his target share, he's had an astonishing 19.23% average through the first 3 weeks. That dipped slightly to 18.52%, so still really, really good though. Ty Chandler's averaged 35% of the snaps through the first 3 weeks. In week 4, he had 12% of the snaps. Obviously, if Aaron Jones is taking on more snaps, that's going to hurt Ty Chandler. When we look at his average rush share, through the first 3 weeks, he had 32.48%. In this week, he only had 8.82%. On average, he's had 4.34% of the targets, but this week he had 3.7%. And so it could just be due to the fact that they were trying to get him more touches for a revenge game in terms of Aaron Jones' uptick in total touches and percentages compared to Ty Chandler. It could be a potential trend. I mean, on a limited sample, Ty Chandler was pretty inefficient this game. I wouldn't pay too much credence to this. I think things will return slightly more to what Aaron Jones has been averaging, but he's still been a fantastic player for us in fantasy. And obviously, he's the back to own. Ty Chandler's really just a pure handcuff at this point. But we'll still need to keep track of the trends here to see if they start leaning more towards what we saw in week 4 versus the first 3 weeks, or if things return to what we saw throughout the first 3 weeks. Looking at the Bengals backfield, Chase Brown and Zach Moss had the same amount of carries. That's a little bit surprising, but Chase Brown went off in this game. He finished with 15 carries, 80 yards, 5.3 per carry, 2 rushing touchdowns with a long of 20, to Zach Moss's 15 for 51, only 3.4 per carry, no rushing touchdowns, and a long of 13. We saw that even last week, Chase Brown was more efficient than Zach Moss, but Zach Moss was a lot more efficient last week than he was this week. And so this is an interesting trend because before this week, things were going downwards for Chase Brown. When you look at the passing game, however, Chase Brown finished with 3 targets, 2 receptions, and 12 yards. It's still Zach Moss's backfield in that regard because he finished with 4 targets, 4 receptions, 27 yards, and 1 receiving touchdown. When we look at the splits through the first 3 weeks, Zach Moss averaged 74% of the snaps. In this game, he went down to 60%. He averaged 56.93% of the rush attempts. In this game, he only had 48.39%. And on average, he had 10.74% of the targets. And this week, he had 10, so that's pretty much the same. But down on the rush share and total snap share as well. When we look at Chase Brown, he had 26% on average of the snaps played. And this week, it went all the way up to 40. We'd like to see that if we're Chase Brown owners. He had a 23.98% rush share average. This week, he went all the way up to 48.39%, matching Zach Moss. And on average, he had 6.08% of the target share. And this week, he had 13.33%. When we compare the two, Chase Brown was much more efficient on the ground for a second straight week, but still Zach Moss is the preferred passing game option. This is definitely going to be a backfield to monitor. One of the more interesting ones, it was looking more so and more so that it was just going to be Zach Moss's backfield, but this game could have changed everything, really. And what are we to conclude of this? Well, it looks as though Chase Brown is working his way towards a 50-50 split. He's definitely not there yet in terms of the snap share, but he had the same amount of rush attempts. He was much more efficient for a second straight week. However, Chase Brown isn't the preferred passing game option. That's still going to be Zach Moss. However, if Chase Brown is able to work himself up to a higher percentage of the targets and rushes, he definitely has a ton of upside. And if there were to be an injury to either one of these running backs, you definitely want to have the other one in your starting lineups. When we look at the Jacksonville Jaguars backfield, this is the second week that Tank Bigsby has been incredibly more efficient than Travis Etienne. Even though Etienne was still pretty efficient himself, Bigsby finished with only 7 carries but 90 total yards, averaging 12.9 per carry with a long of 58. Travis Etienne had 11 carries for 15 yards, 4.5 per carry, not terrible, but not nearly as efficient, obviously, as Bigsby, with a long of 13. And then D'Ernest Johnson finished with 2 carries for 0 yards with a long of 1. Looking at the receiving work, for the 4th straight week, Etienne is really the only guy getting any targets. D'Ernest Johnson has gotten a target this season, but Bigsby hasn't. Travis Etienne finished with 2 targets, including 1 reception for 10 receiving yards. When you look at Tank Bigsby, he's played 15% of the snaps. He's had 19.31% of the rush share for the season. He played 29% of the snaps this week and had a 29.17% rush share. Travis Etienne's played 70% of the snaps on average, and this week he had 52%. On average, he's had 57.59% of the rush attempts. In this game, he only had 45.83%, so that's down. He's averaged a 12.99% target share through the first 4 weeks. This week, he had 6.25%, but he still was the only back targeted. D'Ernest Johnson's played 15% of the snaps throughout the first 3 weeks. He's had 11.86% of the rush attempts, with 0.75% of a target share. In week 4, he had 21% of the snaps played, with an 8.33% rush share, and he wasn't targeted. One thing to note once again was that Tank Bigsby was more efficient by far than Travis Etienne in this game. He missed week 2 with a shoulder injury. He was back for this game and looked really, really good. Travis Etienne coincidentally had a shoulder injury at the beginning of this game, but he was able to return. It's starting to look like Travis Etienne could potentially lose a little bit of his rush share. He did incur more of the rush share when Tank Bigsby went down. D'Ernest Johnson didn't directly replace Bigsby. But with Bigsby looking much more efficient with his touches, specifically his rushes, I'm worried for Etienne that he may find himself in a 50-50 split for the rest of the season with the rush attempts. However, it's looking as though he's definitely keeping the target share. And so I think Etienne is still going to be the running back that you want to play in this backfield. It's just Travis Etienne's looking more and more like a low-end RB2, potentially an RB3, especially if this split continues between him and Bigsby. And Tank Bigsby is a desperation flex play because he isn't getting any receiving usage. D'Ernest Johnson probably can be left on the waiver wires unless you're in a big league, and he's probably not going to get that much work unless both of these running backs go down ahead of him, and then he's probably going to have someone else brought in to help shoulder the load. I wouldn't imagine that he's going to get everything. And so it'll be really interesting to see what the Jaguars continue to do on the ground with Tank Bigsby looking much more efficient. If you like what you're seeing, feel free to like and subscribe. It's a free and easy way to support the channel. I plan on doing these backfield breakdowns each and every single week so that we can keep tabs on these various ambiguous backfields, see what we can ascertain, and try to project for the future. If there's anyone else you'd like me to cover in this backfield breakdown, it's going to be a weekly thing. Let me know below in the comment section. Once again, feel free to like and subscribe. Thank you. Looking at the Dolphins' backfield, it was interesting. Jalen Wright was the most efficient running back. He had 9 carries for 32 yards, averaging 3.6 per carry with a long of 20. He was bottled up mostly the entire game, but he did look explosive on his 20-yard rush. Devon Achane finished with 1 more carry than Jalen Wright, finished with 10 for 15 yards, only 1.5 per carry with a long of 5. He's been bottled up each of the past 2 weeks without Tua. I mean, Jalen Wright wasn't that much better, but he was twice as good, really, but it still isn't saying much with 9 for 32. And yeah, without Tua, this offense is nowhere near the same. When we look at the receiving work, Jalen Wright finished the game with 1 target and no receptions. He did have I believe it was a 5-yard reception called back due to a penalty, but nothing crazy there. Devon Achane was actually the least featured he's been the entire season. I think some of that has to do with Tyler Huntley being the quarterback. He finished with 3 targets, 3 receptions, and 14 yards. And so he had by far the worst game of the season. And really, there wasn't anyone on this entire offense that really had a good fantasy day. Taking a look at the splits, Jeff Wilson's finished with 17% of the total snaps, 12.22% of the total rushes. He hasn't recorded a target yet this season. And this week he was hurt during pregame warmups, and so he only played 3% of the snaps, didn't record a rush or a target. Devon Achane, on average, has played 63% of the snaps. This week it went up to 73%, so he was more featured on a per-snap basis. However, he averaged 55.24% of the rush attempts throughout the first 3 weeks. In this game, he only had 33.33%. That's because Huntley and Jalen Wright took over a lot of these carries. On average, he's also had 18.16% of the target share. That went down to 14.29% in this game, probably to do with Tyler Huntley, but still something to note here because we don't know when Tua is coming back. With Mostert, he hasn't played since week 1, so there isn't too much to glean here. But with Jalen Wright, very, very excited if you have Jalen Wright. He's played 15% of the total snaps so far. He's had 8.61% of the total rushes. But this week, he played 47% of the total snaps. That's almost 50. That's perfect. He is the Raheem Mostert replacement. Watch out for the future. He had 28.13% of the rush attempts. That was almost matching A-Chain's 33.33%. And while he didn't finish with a reception, he still had a target, so 4.76% of a target share in week 4. What can we conclude? It's probably best to avoid all running backs in this backfield until we see something better from their quarterback. Hopefully, for the offense's sake, Tua comes back. Whether or not that's good for his health or life is definitely up for debate, but it's his decision. Moving back to the running backs, though, it's really hard to sit A-Chain. I don't know how you could... It'd be pretty hard in a redraft for you to sit him, considering where you drafted him. In a dynasty, there's a chance that you could afford to sit him. But it's not looking good for any of these guys. With Jalen Wright, it's very encouraging to see his usage go way up in the absence of Jeff Wilson and Raheem Mostert. I do expect his usage to go down significantly because I think Raheem Mostert comes back this next week. But for the future, in the event that Mostert and A-Chain are both hurt, Jalen Wright is going to be somebody you want to pick up. And I think as soon as they get Tua back, because he is planning on returning, we're going to go back to an incredibly efficient offense. It's just for now, we have to really temper expectations. In the meantime, I think that Devon A-Chain is, at this point, a boom or bust RB3. Jalen Wright isn't really startable yet, but as soon as this next season, or if A-Chain and Mostert were both to miss time at the same time, Jalen Wright would probably be a low-end RB2 because he'd be getting just about probably 70% of the total running back touches. And so there's a ton of upside with Jalen Wright and A-Chain. We just need more consistent quarterback play, and that'll happen as soon as Tua comes back. Taking a look at the Raiders' backfield, Alexander Mattison was by far the most efficient running back, finishing with 5 attempts for 60 yards. That's 12.0 per carry, with a long of 24. He didn't score on the ground. Zamir White was once again incredibly inefficient for another week. He also lost a crucial fumble that screwed them over. He finished with 17 carries for 50 yards, only 2.9 per carry with a long of 17. No touchdown either for him. Then the other running back used in this game was Tyreek McAllister. He registered 2 carries for 11 yards. That's 5.5 per pop with a long of 10. I added him to this list. I don't think he's going to end up really being anything long-term, but just in case, he did leave with an injury. Amir Abdullah was dealing with a back injury. He was active, but didn't register any snaps, touches in any way, shape, or form. When we look at the receiving work, Zamir White had 1 target, but he didn't corral it in, so 0 for 0 there. Madison also finished with only 1 target, blanked across the board. And so from a receiving standpoint, the Raiders' backfield was non-existent this week. Really, Alexander Mattison was the only bright spot, and that was just on the ground with 60 total rushing yards. It was a pretty inefficient day. I mean, DJ Turner finished with a rushing touchdown, so did Trey Tucker, so their receivers were stealing all the touchdowns. Usually, Alexander Mattison, though, is the goal line back. He's had 3 touchdowns in the first 3 weeks. Once again, not this week. But in general, if you want to bet for a Raiders running back to score a touchdown, it's going to be Madison. When we look at the splits, throughout the first 3 weeks, Zamir White's played 41% of the snaps, and this week he played 59%, so that is up from his average. However, he was incredibly inefficient, so that may go down. He's averaged 58.15% of the rush attempts. In this game, he had 58.62, so right on average there. On the season, Zamir White's had 5.78% of a target share. In this game, he had 4.17%. When we look at Alexander Mattison, throughout the first 3 weeks, he's played 42% of the snaps. In this game, he only played 36%, so that is down a little bit from his average. Throughout the first 3 weeks, he's had 21.67% of the rush share. In this game, it went down to 17.24%. And on average, he's had 8.81% of the target share. In this game, he had 4.17%. Amir Abdullah, once again, was active with the back injury, but he didn't really do anything. He didn't register a snap. And Ty McAllister played 7% of the snaps, left with an injury, and only had a 6.9% rush share. When we think about the Raiders' backfield, Zamir White is getting the most work, but he's by far the most inefficient player. He lost a fumble that really hurt the Raiders. And so I think he's probably going to see a downtick in work because with a fumble and being really inefficient for multiple weeks in a row, it really just doesn't make any sense for them to feature him at all. Alexander Mattison has been by far their best running back, even though they, for whatever reason, continue to give Zamir White a lot more work. And so I think if you have to play any of these running backs, Madison is a desperation flex play because if he doesn't score you a touchdown, you're going to be pretty disappointed. But when he does, he'll give you a pretty decent week. Zamir White, I would not start in any way, shape, or form. He's getting the work, but he's just so inefficient and isn't the goal line back that there's really just not much upside. And obviously, you're not playing Amir Abdullah or Ty McAllister. And yeah, I would probably avoid this backfield altogether once again and continue to avoid it unless we see Alexander Mattison incur a lot more work. Besides Madison, I don't think any of the other running backs in this backfield offer any upside. Taking a look at the Buccaneers backfield, I was thoroughly impressed with Rachaad White on the ground. Usually he's the most inefficient running back in the entire NFL on the ground. Well, in this game he had 10 for 49, that's 4.9 per carry. Very, very solid for him, a long of 17. Bucky Irving finished with the same stat line, but he finished with the rushing touchdown. Baker Mayfield also stole one. Sean Tucker finished with 1 attempt for 3 yards. And so overall, it's basically a 50-50 split at this point on the ground between Irving and White. When we look at the receiving game, though, Sean Tucker finished with 1 target, 1 catch for 14 yards. Bucky Irving finished with 2 targets, 1 reception for 6 yards. Rachaad White was by far the best receiving back. That's pretty standard. He's a very good receiving back. He finished with 3 targets, 2 receptions, and 35 receiving yards. When we take a look at the splits, through the first 3 weeks, Bucky Irving's played 33% of the snaps, while he had 42% in week 4. He's starting to trend more and more towards a 50-50 split with Rachaad White. He's had 38.39% of the rush attempts, while in this game he had 40%, so that's up slightly. And he's had 6.46% of the target share. In this game he had 4.26, so down just a little bit. Rachaad White has played 72% of the total snaps. In this game, he only played 58%, so that's significantly down. Although, with his performance in this game, he may earn a little bit more. We'll have to see how that plays out. He's had 43.66% of the rush attempts. In this game, he had 40%, so down just a little bit. And on average, he's had 14.67% of the target share. In this game, he had 6.38%, but he was still the most targeted back. Sean Tucker's played 2% of the total snaps with 2.08% of the rush share. In this game, he had an 8% snap share with a 4% rush share and a 2.13% target share. At this point, Sean Tucker is starting to establish himself just a little bit, but he's basically an afterthought in this backfield. It would definitely take 1 injury, but potentially 2 for him to really incur a significant role. Rachaad White's starting to lose more and more work. However, with this game, he may be able to fend off Bucky Irving for just a little bit. And for Bucky Irving, he's definitely trending upward. He's been really efficient basically every single game. It is encouraging to see that Bucky Irving had a rushing touchdown. Rachaad White is generally going to be the goal line back, so that's probably unlikely to continue. And in the receiving game, it's still going to lean Rachaad White, but Bucky Irving's still very good there as well. And so at this point, in my opinion, Rachaad White is probably a high-end RB3 at this point, and Bucky Irving's probably a low-end RB3. They're trending towards being mid RB3s. If they have a nearly even split, I'd probably lean Rachaad White because he's more likely to get a touchdown. But at this point, they're both handicapping each other's upside. If you could sit them, I would prefer to sit all of these running backs, but it's probably unlikely in a redraft considering where you had to draft Rachaad White. I'd consider him an RB3 once again, probably a high end at this point due to the rushing touchdown upside. And with Bucky Irving, probably a low-end RB3 once again. Probably an okay flex play if you really need him. But at this point, they're both handicapping each other and really hurting each other's value. At this point, I would avoid this backfield altogether, but if there is an injury to either Bucky Irving or Rachaad White and one misses the game, I would definitely feel comfortable starting the other because they're bound to get a good amount of work in what's a potent offense. Moving on to the most confounding backfield in the entire NFL, at least in my opinion, the Denver Broncos. Javonte Williams finished this game with 16 carries for 77 yards. That's 4.8 per carry with a long of 16 with no rushing touchdown. Jaleel McLaughlin had 9 carries for 46 yards, averaging 5.1 per carry with a long of 10. Tyler Beatty finished with 1 attempt for 0 yards. He was injured, and so prayers up to him. It looked pretty nasty. I believe he was put on a stretcher. And so I think it was reported though that he's doing well and is returning to the team, so that's good for him. When you look at the receiving work, Tyler Beatty finished with 2 targets. He made 2 catches, but he lost 4 yards, and his long was -1, so a little bit disappointing for him there. Jaleel McLaughlin finished with 1 target. He wasn't able to corral it. And looking at Javonte Williams, he finished with 3 targets, 2 receptions, and 3 yards. Overall, from a receiving standpoint, for everybody involved, it was a day to forget. I mean, 60 total passing yards is absolutely abysmal. The only receiver that was worth anything was Cortland Sutton in this game, and he was still pretty inefficient with his targets. He just had a long touchdown. Looking at the backfield splits, Jaleel McLaughlin has played 30% of the snaps so far. In this game, he played 34%, so a slight uptick there. When we look at the rush share through weeks 1 to 3, he had 25.54% of that. In this game, he had 29.03, so also an uptick in that regard. And he's had 4.95% of the target share through the first 3 weeks. In this game, he had 4, so a slight downtick there, but pretty negligible. When we look at Javonte Williams, he's averaged 56% of the snaps. In this game, he had 57%, so a little bit slightly up, but negligible too. He's had 39.54% of the rush share through weeks 1 to 3. In this game, he went up to 51.61%, so definitely an uptick in that regard. And throughout the first 3 weeks, he had 10.56% of the target share. In this game, he had 12%, so also a slight uptick there. Good news for him. Audric Estime has been hurt since week 1. And Tyler Beatty, he was hurt as well in this game, so he only ended up playing 8% of the snaps. I think he was well on his way to earning a much larger share here. And so we'll have to see how that plays out. Looking at this backfield, it's pretty hard to be confident in anybody. If you had to choose, I'd choose Javonte Williams just because in general he's getting a much higher share of the rush attempts as well as the target share, but he hasn't looked good either. And Jaleel McLaughlin has by far been the best back in my opinion. He just hasn't been getting the consistent work. But as far as this backfield, I would completely avoid this at all costs unless you are just desperate for somebody. Javonte Williams is maybe a mid to low end RB3 at this point. He'll get you some yardage, but there's just really isn't much upside with him. Jaleel McLaughlin has the same amount of upside probably in any given week, but he just has a much lower floor because he's more efficient with his touches. It's just that he doesn't get as many. And we'll have to continue to monitor Tyler Beatty because he was looking really good before the injury, at least last week. And so if he returns and he starts to get more work again, this backfield may end up being a complete avoid at all costs. But for now, you can play Javonte, but I would be terrified if I had to play anyone else in this backfield. The final backfield that we'll look at here is the Dallas Cowboys. Rico Dowdle led the backfield with 11 attempts for 46 yards. That's 4.2 per carry with a long of 9. He didn't score a rushing touchdown. Zeke was second. He finished with 5 attempts for 19 yards, averaging 3.8 per carry with no touchdown and a long of 8. And Deuce Vaughn didn't register any touches in this game or targets. When we take a look at the receiving game, Zeke Elliott finished with 1 target, 1 reception, and 5 yards with no touchdown. And Rico Dowdle finished with 1 target, 1 reception, 15 yards, and a touchdown. And so if you did start Rico Dowdle, you're pretty happy with him. If you started anybody else in this backfield, that was not very fun for you. Taking a look at the splits, Rico Dowdle has played 44% of the snaps through weeks 1 to 3. This week he played 45%, so right on par there. He's had 38.44% of the rush share through weeks 1 to 3. In this game, he stepped it up to 47.83%, so nearly half. Very encouraging for him. He's had an 8.48% target share. In this game, he had 3.85%, although he tied for the lead in the backfield, so they weren't passing to the running backs in this game. Zeke Elliott's played 37% of the snaps through weeks 1 to 3. However, from weeks 1 to 4, his snap count has decreased each and every week. He's had 29.11% of the rush share through weeks 1 to 3. In this game, he had 21.74%, so downward trajectory there. Zeke's had 5.92% of the target share through weeks 1 to 3. In this game, he had 3.85%, but he still tied for the lead with Rico Dowdle. And Deuce Vaughn played 7% of the snaps, but he didn't register a touch. And what we can conclude here is that Rico Dowdle is starting to be somebody that you can confidently start in the flex. Zeke's being phased out of the backfield, and Deuce Vaughn really isn't anything to fear. And yeah, Rico Dowdle is the running back to own. He generally has the highest target share. He's working his way up to 50% of the total rush share, while also having the highest snap share in general. He's definitely a lot safer than either of the other two running backs, and he's trending positively. And that concludes the backfield breakdown for week 4. The backfield that still has my eye is the Denver Broncos backfield. It looks like Javonte Williams is generally more often than not going to be the guy you want to play if you have to play any of them, but it is just all over the place on a week-to-week basis. Tyler Beatty was starting to take over before his injury. We'll have to keep tabs on that, but that one is the most interesting to me. Which of these backfields confounds you the most? Let me know below in the comment section. I'm curious what you think. Also, is there any other backfield you want me to add so that we can monitor the snap, rush, and target share from a week-to-week basis? If so, once again, just let me know below in the comment section. With that being said, if you like what you've seen and heard in this video, feel free to like and subscribe. It's a free and easy way to support the channel, and I'd really appreciate it. Thank you, and have a good day.